My name is Allison Snikes. I'm a facilitator at a self-directed education center, Rhett and Learning Cooperative in the U.S. Liberated Learners, the host of this session, works with individuals interested to create self-directed education centers. And in an effort to get the word out about SDE, we organize events such as this session with Dr. Naomi Fisher. Super excited to be here. So great to have Naomi with us today. Andrea Kubela-McKay, a facilitator at Embark Center for Self-Directed Education in the U.S., will be running the Q&A portion in the second half of the session, and will be helping out in the chat. Today, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Naomi Fisher, a practicing clinical psychologist and mother of two young people who have never been to conventional school. Naomi joined us last winter to talk about the topics in her first book, Changing Our Minds, How Children Can Take Control of Their Own Learning. We are delighted to have her back to share about her most recent book, A Different Way to Learn, Neurodiversity and Self-Directed Education. I imagine many of you are well aware that in addition to her books, Naomi has a Substack newsletter blog. It's called Think Again. I love the subtitle, Making Childhood Fit for Children. Oh, just love that. She posts regularly in her Facebook and Instagram pages. We'll put these in the chat. She offers webinars and courses for a more in-depth experience, lots of things. So Naomi is passionate about letting people know that there are many ways to live and learn outside of school. In today's session, Naomi will talk about how neurodivergent children can use self-directed learning to have a more fulfilling and meaningful education. So please welcome Dr. Naomi Fisher.
Hello, thank you. It's so nice to be here. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, someone give me a thumbs up to tell me they can see it? Just great, thank you. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about self-directed education for neurodivergent children, and I've called this talk Finding Another Way to Live and Learn. And this is really a talk that's inspired by my book, A Different Way to Learn, and the illustrations in this presentation are by Eliza Fricker, who also illustrated the book. So just to give you a quick chat about who I am, in case you don't know. So I'm a clinical psychologist, which actually means that I am a psychologist who specializes in mental health. So I'm not a psychiatrist, the medical doctors, I'm a psychologist. So my training is in human behavior, and then I specialize in mental health. People are often surprised when I say that because they think that I should be an educational psychologist, because at least in the UK, we have a kind of division between clinical psychologists and educational psychologists, and educational psychologists are the people who work in schools. I don't work in schools, and I haven't ever worked in schools, but I do work with young people. And my work with young people has made me increasingly concerned about what's happening in schools. But also, one of the things that happened for me was when I had my own children, who are now 12 and 15, I was I felt really conflicted between the way I could see them learning and actually what my psychology training had taught me about how young children learn and how older children learn as well, and then what they were going to be put through if they went to school. And I just couldn't see it going well for either of my children, actually. So I decided that wouldn't happen, and we were going to do something different. And then as I did that, and I made that choice, the more we got into it, the more I was just thinking all the time, there's so much here that is so important, and I don't think people are talking about this enough. I don't think people know that there are even other options. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And I'm going to start off by just talking about neurodiversity, because I think one of the things that was very clear to me, certainly looking at writings about children all the way through the last couple of 100 years, that there's always been some children who break the mold. They make it clear that the status quo, the way things usually work, doesn't work for them. And sometimes their development is a bit out of sync with what might be expected by society. So maybe they do some things faster, they do other things slower. And they are often divergent thinkers, and they ask questions which gets everybody else scratching their heads, and they challenge adult expectations and conversations. These are the children I'm going to talk about today. And these children may have diagnoses. Some of them do, some of them don't. They have a whole different, and I'm just going to refer to them through this talk as children. So what happens to these children at school? Well, the school system generally expects a certain standardization of development. It expects when you go into the school system at 4 or 5 in England, maybe a little bit older in the United States and in different countries around the world, it expects you to be doing certain things because of your age. And if you're not doing that, if you're not behaving in the way that society expects you to behave at age 5, for example, then often what happens is that children and their parents are told that they are the problem, that they need to change. Or sometimes what happens is nobody says that because they seem to be okay, but actually inside they feel unhappy and anxious. And one of the messages that these children get, I think, and really strongly, is it's my fault, or there's something wrong with me. And this strand of what I'm thinking about and what I'm talking about today has really come from my work with autistic adults, because I work as a clinical psychologist, as a therapist, and I have clients who are children, adolescents, and adults. And when I've talked to autistic adults in particular, they often tell me about this kind of pervading sense that there's something wrong with me, which they had all the way through school. So I was always thinking, what could be different? What could we do differently for children? So I think I'm just going to talk a tiny bit about neurodiversity and how I understand neurodiversity. So I think neurodiversity is the idea that difference does not have to necessarily mean disordered. So children are very different, adults are very different, people are very different. And the way that that's often seen is that the children who are quite different from everybody else are disordered in some way, have something wrong with them. And that's what we call the medical model. It's something that I was trained in as a clinical psychologist, where we kind of diagnose a certain group of children. We say, these children, they're different. There's something wrong with them. And neurodiversity kind of tips that on its head and says, there doesn't have to be anything wrong with children. There's nothing wrong with variation. In fact, variation in the human race is a strength. We need people who are different. That is how our community, our human community thrives. We need people who are really good at different things. We need people who prefer different ways of being, because that's what kind of helps us survive as a whole community. And we don't need to see these people, this variation, as any kind of disorder. And the other thing that I think is really important about this idea of neurodiversity is that it talks about, I think it's about the interaction between the child and their environment. So we say we have the child with certain characteristics at a certain stage of their life. What determines whether that child really thrives and flourishes or not is their environment. It's the environment they go into. And if there's a rigid environment that meets a child who generally can't be particularly flexible at the early age, young children aren't often terribly flexible, then we have distress and disability resulting because the environment isn't able to meet the needs of the child. So neurodiversity in itself is absolutely not the same as either distress or disability. It's just a description of how different people are different. But if we have a child who has a particular way of being, they meet an inflexible environment, then what can result from that is distress and disability. So I set out for my book, which was published earlier this year, to interview families who had neurodivergent children. They self-identified as having a neurodivergent child, sometimes several neurodivergent children, and who had chosen to educate those children out of the school system. So the way this book worked was I actually started with interviews. I looked for families, and I did this thing that they talk about in qualitative research, where basically I asked as many families as I could find to tell me about what it was like, what they did with their children, until I got to the point where I was hearing the same stories again. And it was great. I heard so many different stories, and then I used their stories to bring the kind of book together. And I sort of produced a couple of theories, which I'll tell you about, but also I used their stories through the book. So what do I mean by self-directed education? Because that's what I was looking for, families who were doing self-directed education. I really mean education where the learner can choose what they do and how they learn something and when they stop. That to me is really important, that the learner is the person who says, I've had enough now. I want to do this, I've had enough now. I don't think, the way I define self-directed education anyway, is that it isn't limited to any particular kind of pedagogy. So sometimes people talk about self-directed education as just being learning from the world around you, but not doing any kind of focused study. That isn't how I would define it, because I would say if the learner wants to do focused study, then that can be self-directed. It's when that focused study is imposed upon the learner that it stops being self-directed. So just to explain what I mean about this interaction between children and their environment, I'm going to talk about two composite children. So these aren't real children. I've made them up to make a point, but they are based on real children who I have met and talked to from my book. So the first child is Zara. Zara's 9, and she is a schooler, as my children would say. She was at an excellent school. She finds it really hard to sit still. When everybody's sitting in class and working, she gets up and goes and wanders around. Zara tries really hard, but she can't stay focused and still. And her parents are called in, and at first they're told her that she needs to try harder and she should pay more attention. She tries, but it just isn't happening. And so eventually they recommend that she goes and has an ADHD assessment. Now, next door lives Zarina. Zarina is also 9, and she doesn't go to school. She's a self-directed learner. She spends her days bouncing on her indoor trampoline, swimming, riding her bike, and playing. And that is pretty well what she does. She's always on the go. She can't read yet. She can't do a lot of the things that Zara can do, but she's really happy. She's just moving all the time. Now, Zarina at the moment doesn't have a problem. But if we put her in a position where she has to sit still for a long time or expect her to pay attention for something that she's bored with, then we have a problem, because she's going to start protesting, and we're going to see that problem in her behavior. So in Zara's world, her tendency to be very active is a problem, and in Zarina's, it isn't. So it's not the children who are different, it's their environment. For one child, their environment is enabling them to live the way they want to live, and for the other child, it's not. I think this is a theme that just came out all the way through my book, how much environments mattered. So this is an illustration by Eliza. So the child at the top is climbing a tree, and the adult is saying, wow, look at her go. And then the child in the bottom is climbing onto a Portakabin roof, and the adult's saying, get down from there immediately. And this illustration was actually inspired by one of the families I talked to, this was a mother who had 3 neurodivergent children, and her eldest 2 children had gone to school for quite a while. And she told me, she said that the years when they were at school were really difficult. And what would happen was that she would drop them off at school, she would go to work, and then within an hour, she would have a call to say, they're on the Portakabin roof again, can you come and get them down? And ultimately, her employer said, you're going to have to choose between answering these calls from the school or your job. And she was like, well, there's no choice, is there? I haven't got a choice about this. I have to go and get my children down from the Portakabin roof. And she took her children out from school, and she describes now how they learn. And it was amazing, the kind of difference when they weren't in kind of survival mode all the time. Her children had been in survival mode at school. Because what happens is when we have really variable children and they meet rigid expectations, then we have a problem. And often what happens is we blame that problem on the children. So over time, the difference between Zara and Zarina gets bigger rather than smaller. And this is something that sort of surprised me, I think, when my children didn't go to school. I think I had this expectation that after a few years, they would become kind of more like school children. I think I sort of thought that maybe around 7 or 8, they'd sort of want to settle down and want to start doing formal education. And actually what happened was, as they carried on developing, the gap between them and school children just seemed to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So what happens to Zara and Zarina? So Zara does get her diagnosis of ADHD, and she's really relieved about that because she feels better. She feels it's not her fault. And she takes medication, and as she grows up, she has to keep taking that medication because she's worried that without it, she's going to fall apart. And understandably, this is really important to her. Her diagnosis is really important to her. And I've met many children like Zara. Zarina is a bit different because she's not at school. So no one is kind of saying there's a problem here. So she stays active and she learns to advocate for herself. She learns to know that she has to stay active. She feels confident in herself and that her way of being is okay. And as she grows up, she does start to find that she can sit for longer, but she also still finds it helps for her to bounce whenever she thinks, and so she does. As she grows older, she might decide that she wants a diagnosis if it's helpful for her, and that in the meantime, she wears through several mini trampolines in her house because she bounces and bounces and bounces. So Zara and Zarina are both neurodivergent, and they're both learning how to think about themselves. That's what's happening as they're growing up. They're learning how to think about themselves. And I think the environment that we provide for our children has a really strong influence on how they grow up to think about themselves, other people, and the world around them. And that's kind of what I'm trying to talk about when I'm talking about neurodiversity in school. What a big difference we can make by changing the environment for our children. So how do neurodivergent children learn outside school? So I talked to lots of parents and young people about their experiences of self-directed education. And I'm going to read an extract from one of those books right now. I think, if I can find the right one. Let me get some. I'm going to show you the illustration once I do it, because I really love this illustration by Eliza. So this is about neurodivergent thinkers. So you've got the learning objective with the teacher at the front, and the learning objective says, learning objective, balance your book. And then we've got the children, and they're all balancing their books on their heads. And then the child at the end is thinking, why can't we read them instead? And the teacher saying, very good, keep going. And I really like this example because I often talk about neurodivergent children as being very clear-sighted, that they kind of seem to see through the rules and regulations that other children just seem to accept. There seem to be the children who are there holding their flag saying, hang on a minute, why are we doing this? Can't we do it some other way? And that's one of the reasons I really love working with neurodivergent children. So I'm going to just read some little clips from the book. And these clips are from Emily, who's the mother I talked about, who has the 3 children, who was always getting called in to the porter cabin, to come down from the porter cabins. And her middle son is autistic, and he's also got cerebral palsy. And he spent several years in a specialist unit in school before leaving to be home educated. This is what she said. Learning at home with him was about enabling him in different ways, finding those different resources, those paths, those different ways to help him learn. He's so creative. He loves Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit at the moment. He's creating characters from Lego figures. He's extending the story out, and then we're using clicker software, word processing, to allow him to get his stories out. They're phenomenal, to the point where he's like, oh, I want to be a storyteller. I want to be a voice actor. And I'm like, oh, you have communication difficulties and you'd like to do that? You chose a hard one. And then she also talked about her youngest son, who's non-speaking autistic and who's never gone to school. And she told me that with her youngest son, they knew very early on that he was autistic. She said he was really classic autistic. He would never make eye contact with him. They knew right from the start. And she said, because he was autistic and so clearly from the start, it was assumed by everybody that they would send him to school. And she said, after we've had this experience with our 2 older boys, why would we then send the one who can't express himself and who isn't going to be able to say if things are wrong? Why would we send him to this environment when the other boys have had such a bad time? So this is her talking about Liam, her youngest, who's 12, when I talked to her. Liam is incredibly intelligent. It's really hard with Liam because obviously he can't talk to you. He taught himself to read as a baby. He was picking up letters and things. And even before the age of 1, he was doing left to right reading. He is obsessed with reading. He loves his books. I think that opens up an awful lot for kids for the self-directed learning. Liam is very much directing his own learning, even with his difficulties. He reads anything and everything that he can grab hold of that he likes, with the pictures and things. All of the Julia Donaldson books are his favourites. We've got the illustrated versions of Harry Potter. The night is terrible for sleeping. He only needs a couple of hours sleep, but he's learned that when it's bedtime, he stays in his room and he reads about 10 or 15 books a night. I really loved talking to Emily because she just described so well how she nurtured her children in very different ways and how they were very different. So the children, I talked to lots of different families like Emily. And what families told me was that their experiences were very different to what they had read beforehand about self-directed education. So they often said that they had read things about how children would come out of school and they would just be learning and they would be playing and they would be able to go to groups and they would do all this kind of thing. And actually what happened, particularly if their children had been at school, was that children resisted all suggestions that they made. And it was often a real struggle for them to leave the house. And families reported feeling really isolated and unsupported, and they found it difficult to say how bad things were, and they found it difficult to tell other people because they felt like even within a community of other self-directed educators, it felt like they were different. And they sometimes had tried learning communities or self-directed learning settings, but they said their children found it really hard to settle, and also they find it hard to comply with some of the expectations when they were there. So based on all the interviews that I did, I devised this kind of model to encapsulate what they told me. And I call it the pyramid of self-directed education. And essentially what it is it's saying that before a child can start to really flourish and learn, they need to feel safe. And for neurodivergent children, it can take a lot longer to feel safe than it might for other children. Feeling safe in their environment is really fundamental. And that can be feeling safe. I talked about three different ways in which children need to feel safe. There's the physical environment. So there's actually feeling safe in your body, knowing that there's going to be food that you like to eat, knowing that you're warm enough or cool enough and that you can regulate your body, your environment around your body. Then there's the sort of psychological. So that's whether you feel emotionally safe, whether you feel that it's okay for you to make mistakes, for example, or whether you're worried that you're going to be blamed for things. And then, sorry, you've got a cough. So then, and there's also physiological. So I've just combined those two by mistake, but physical environment, so the actual environment around you, physiological, your body, and psychological, your emotions and your thoughts. And Eliza did me a lovely pyramid drawing to sort of illustrate that pyramid of what it's like often when neurodivergent children in particular come out of school. And at first, a lot of it, what they might do might actually be being in bed or being just on a sofa. And what parents told me is in that time, what they had to do was really get alongside their children and connect with their children. And that could take a long time, particularly if children had had a really bad time at school. And then once children started to feel safer, they would move up to the next stage of the pyramid, which is when they were just starting to explore new things. And I thought about this as a bit like kind of little green shoots coming out from their safety zone. So the bottom is like establishing a safety zone. The safety zone is not just, it's about how they expect adults to respond to them, how they know that they won't be met with blame or with judgment. The next level up is feeling safe enough to start to make little suggestions, to say, maybe, could we go and buy chocolate buttons? Could we go to the shop? Or I'd quite like to play this new game, just teeny things. And parents said that at that stage, they had to be really careful not to jump on anything and get too enthusiastic, because that would kind of squash those green shoots again. And then as children started to feel more confident in exploring, it moved to the stage of flourishing. And flourishing was when the child was able to pursue the things that they wanted to do, to follow their interests. And that wasn't necessarily the case. They often couldn't immediately follow their interests when they came out of school, because they were so traumatized and upset by what had happened. And I've now talked to staff in self-directed learning settings as well, who've talked about when children are in this stage of needing safety, it can be really challenging because they can find anything to do with school triggers them, really. Like, I've talked to many parents who told me that their children wouldn't read for years after coming out of school, despite maybe having even gone into school as competent readers and people who like books. They wouldn't let them go near any books at all. And what parents told me was the most important thing was getting alongside their children. And I've drawn this, or Eliza's drawn this sort of tightrope of a parent being there with their child, saying, it's okay, I'm here. And the child's going, Mum. And I think that kind of sense of I'm here with you was really important. So what parents did in that recovery period is they dropped demands and expectations. They often apologised for what has gone wrong before, because if a child's been in school, often there's been things like the parents have been kind of involved with trying to make the children go to school. They give clear messages about what happened wasn't your fault. There's nothing wrong with you. And then they joined the child where they were. And that was often up behind a screen. That was often in a video game. Or even some parents even told me that they would love it to be a video game because it was YouTube videos, watching the same YouTube videos again and again and again. And there was an unconditional acceptance of what the child was doing, where the child was at, which was really important. And they talked about many, many different ways to feel safe. So these are a few examples of places that children felt safe. Lots of parents talked about their children feeling safe on a screen and a video game, watching, this is Mr. Stampy Cat, watching Stampy Longnose, is a very popular YouTuber. Then maybe reading books was a safe place for some children, like Liam that I read about bouncing. Some children felt safe outside, but not all children. And some children felt really good in water or something like, or doing things like swimming was really important for them. And over time, the children became more ready to explore. And then it was a really important process of the parents being there as facilitators, but not being too kind of emotionally invested in what the children did. So parents would tell me that if the child sort of made a tentative suggestion of doing something and the parent was like, yeah, let's do it, then that would be enough to squash it and it wouldn't happen. So the parents said we had to cultivate this way of being really, yeah, okay, we could do that, we could not, really just being there with them and just kind of letting them have their own process. And the kind of things that they said happened when children were getting to this stage was generally nothing like school. So parents often said, they were expecting that children would want to do stuff like school, and generally they didn't. Generally what they started to do was maybe things like cooking, or wanting to go to the local shop, or maybe saying maybe rather than no when a suggestion was made, playing online with a friend, trying out a new video game, giving it a go, or maybe listening to an audiobook. So there were kind of little things that children would start to do. And then what the families told me was that children learnt by doing more of what worked for them. So if peers were too much for them, then they interacted with adults or older children. And if groups were too much, then they interacted one-on-one. And if one-on-one with peers is too much, then they had an older or younger child. And when they had enough socialising, they stopped. And that was a really important part of the self-directed learning journey for these families, for the children to learn that they could stop when they needed to stop. And the way I thought about that was that what was happening with the self-directed families was that their approach to their child was, let's help you do more of what you enjoy. And that was giving the child a really strong message that you're okay as you are. And it seemed like what was happening to lots of these children at school was a kind of message of, we need to help you be less different. We need to get you to change so that you're less like you are and more like the other children in your class. I think the really important bit about it for me was that self-directed education seemed to allow children with really different developmental trajectories to feel positive about themselves, which is something that often doesn't happen in the school system. And I know this from having worked with children who are in the school system, that generally children who are developmentally slightly different to their peers in any way, actually, whether they're like further ahead and behind are not good terms, they're school terms, but let's think about reading, say you're ahead in reading, actually that can also be a problem in school, just as being behind in reading can be a problem in school. So I liked this roller coaster because it's this kind of idea, we're in this together, but also there's going to be ups and downs. That was something that came out really strongly from the interviews I did with families. This is not an easy path. It wasn't this idea that we'd take the child out of school and suddenly everything would be fine. It was very much a question of getting alongside your child and helping them to do the things they wanted to do and kind of sticking with it through the ups and the downs. And one of the things which I found really interesting was that as the children reached puberty, their parents described the quality of what they did changing. So basically, children started to set goals for themselves and they started to deliberately practice and get better at things. So that the things that parents described their children doing as they got to sort of about 9 or 10 upwards is they'd start doing things like learning to turn forward rolls. So they would become really, really determined they were going to turn forward rolls, and they'd do it again and again and again. Or they'd ride bicycles, or they'd learn to swim. Some of them would learn to read and write at that stage. They might code. Some families told me about their children learning to beat the Ender Dragon in Minecraft, that they'd played Minecraft for years, and then as they started getting towards puberty, it was like they kind of got an extra determination. And they were like, now I've got what it takes and I'm going to beat the Ender Dragon. And this happened really gradually over time, generally between the ages of 9 and 13. And the children also continued to do a lot of playing, and that became more sophisticated and more complex. And I'm going to just read an example of the learning change. So this is actually an American unschooler who had 4 children, and she talked to me about her eldest children who are now teenagers. She said, my oldest son has been studying Japanese for about 3 years. He started with YouTube videos. Then he asked me for some flashcards. He got a bunch of books about Japanese and the etiquette there, all the things. Then a year ago, he finally said, I want to take some classes to talk to other people. He's now up to 3 classes a week. I've just noticed in my own life that with the kids who want more structure, they can create more structure. If they want less structure, they can create less structure. They all have structure, but it doesn't necessarily look like how I would have structured it. That's the whole thing. They create the structure that they need, and when they need help, they ask for help. And then one other I'm going to read, which is a 15-year-old. So this was an autistic boy who had, his mother describes him as basically having played video games up to the age of about 12 or 13. And when I talked to her, he had just turned 15. And she said this: he's just turned 15. At the moment, he's learning languages, and it's quite incredible. He spends about 3 to 4 hours a day on these languages. This is a guy who pretty much gamed for 2 years. Now he was concerned on Christmas Day about taking the day off his work, and he's learning to code. The last year between the lockdowns, when we were allowed out, he started going to quite a lot of different clubs and things. I can see that his sense of safety is increasing, and he's able to do things on his own terms. He knows himself. Now he wants to start study groups. So now he wants me to set up some kind of study group that he can be a part of so that he can learn with other people. And they told me about all sorts of different things that their teenagers were doing. And the way I thought about it was that they were just developing a sense of themselves in relation to others. So they were teenagers were getting this real chance to decide how much time they wanted to spend with others, what kind of social gatherings worked for them, what helps them to participate in things, and how did they learn best, and how do they manage their own time. And I thought that's amazing, because actually, if you go to school, you don't really get the chance to learn all those kind of things. You have to figure those out after you've left school. And certainly in my experience, when I think about my experience at university, I think a lot of us were figuring out all of these kind of things, and we were doing it without the support of our parents at that stage, because we'd left home. We were young adults by this stage, and we were having to figure out all of these things. And when I heard about these teenagers and what they were doing, it felt like they were getting this chance to work out a lot of this stuff beforehand. Many parents said they, yeah.
I just want to say 5 minutes or so, or, it's
Great,
35
that's
minutes
good.
in, so.
That's fine. I'm going to be 5 minutes. That sounds great. Right. So lots of parents told me they just could not have imagined what their teenagers would have been like when they were younger children. So many described their very, very challenging children becoming these level-headed, hard-working teenagers. And those who'd resisted all suggestions as young children, their parents would say they're up for anything, meaning that they want to do things. And just like the reading I just read, those who didn't stick at anything when they were younger would spend hours practicing the piano or languages. So there was a really qualitative shift in how children learnt between those who were prepubescent and then developing through adolescence. I also talked to some teenagers who told me about their lives, and they told me that they trusted in their ability to learn and that they saw themselves as capable people. They often told me that they enjoyed learning, and one of them in particular told me that she really enjoyed learning even if she wasn't good at something. So this was a young woman, she was 17, she had autism and ADHD, and she told me that she really, really loved biology, but she was no good at it. And I thought, that's amazing. I don't think I could imagine meeting a 17-year-old who'd gone through the school system who would say that they really loved something, and they weren't good at it. It's like in the school system, being good at something is an intrinsic part of enjoying it or feeling good about it. You're not allowed to enjoy things that you're not good at. And actually, because I interviewed a few kind of academics for this book as well, and one of the things that Carlo Ricci talked about, he's a Canadian professor, and he said that he thinks one of the things we lose at school is the ability to enjoy doing things we're not good at. So he said he's really, really bad at singing, but he enjoys singing, and he thinks he should be able to enjoy singing even though he's bad at it. But he said throughout school he was told that wasn't okay. So some of the young people were doing exams, others weren't, but they all had plans and passions. They were all doing things. And their trajectories were really variable and really hard to predict. So this is another illustration by Eliza, and she's done gravestones where it says things like played at being a cat, 2001 to 2012, became a vet, 2022, couldn't write, 2004 to 2009, wrote first novel, aged 40 years, non-compliant, 2005 to 2010, groundbreaking creative, 2015 onwards, never stopped moving, 2005 to 2010, acrobat, 2015 to 2021. So just a last little bit about some of the challenges. So some parents definitely talked about challenges. It was not an easy ride for people, and it had never been an easy thing to do, I think, is really. And I think sometimes parents thought that what they read on social media, perhaps, about self-directed education often kind of presented an overly positive view to them, that they thought, we'll leave school, all our problems will be over. And it wasn't like that. There were lots of challenges. They said that they often wanted their children to learn in a group setting, but this often took really intense support, either from them or from someone else, and that was hard to manage in self-directed learning settings. They said that they sometimes felt isolated and they found it hard to meet other families like them. And they'd often said they'd found their community nationally and internationally rather than locally. And they said they did have problems with groups sometimes, because they said sometimes group leaders would think that inclusive really meant we treat everyone the same, and that this wasn't adequate, that they needed more understanding of their children. Families also said that they began to question everything. So they described a complete redefining of their priorities. Parents said that they'd often become more aware of their own differences as they embraced their children's differences. And they started to challenge the norms of everything, the norms of society, not just the norms of school. And this is another gorgeous illustration of a child seeing kind of hope in the future, seeing learning, joy, relationships, excitement and motivation. And they're cutting through tests, assessments, pressure, attainments, comparisons and expectations. I've got one last short reading that I'm going to read, and then I'm pretty well at the end. So this is a reading about from Jessica, who's a mother, and Jessica has two sons, both autistic, and the older one has ADHD. He also has bilateral hearing loss and PDA. And she took him out of school in year 2 of the English system, which I think is about like second or third grade. He was 7 anyway. And he had had a really bad time at school. He had, and the school had seen him as badly behaved. So she had been ringing up the school saying, I think he's really anxious. He was very disruptive at school. And the school was saying, we don't recognize this as anxiety. We don't recognize this as an anxious child. We just think it's behavior. So she took him out, and it was a long recovery period for him because he had been so traumatized by what happened to him in school. But she didn't realize that for a while. And she talks very much about the learning process that she went through with him. So she took him out of school in the September, and then this is what she said. By January, I thought we'd be ready to do some proper learning. It was horrendous. The whole school stress came straight back into the house. I just tried to do a nice topic, the skeleton, the human body. I have a very vivid memory of him. Me. Can you just sit and listen for 5 minutes? I was pleading with him to try and do this. He turned to me at the age of 7 and said, you want this, I don't. I had tried for a few weeks to get this semi-structured learning thing to work, but this was the pivotal moment. Good on him for speaking up, and I'm proud that I had learned from my previous mistakes, and this time I listened to him. I had to cast aside my preference for semi-structured learning. The more I learned about education and about PDA, the more I realized that unschooling, self-directed education, or autonomous education was the most aligned philosophy for him. I was totally out of my comfort zone. It has taken a huge amount of change, faith, and trust to move me from structure and control to respect, connection, and autonomy, not just in education, but in parenting too. A total 180-degree change in direction. It was one of the best things I have ever done, and we have never, ever looked back. So, in conclusion, I think self-directed education can provide an alternative for many young people for whom school does not work, but it does often look different, and this can be hard for parents who don't know what to expect. Some young people need a lot of stabilizing before they're ready to venture out, and the safety, flexibility, and relationships are what parents said were really key. And I think my big take home from the book, from all the interviews I did, was that perhaps the most powerful thing we can do for our young people is to stop trying to make them fit into the mold, stop trying to get them to do what we think they should be doing, and instead start with them. So thank you very much. These are my books. If anybody is interested, Changing Our Mind is my first book. A Different Way to Learn is this one, which I've been reading from. And A Family Experience of PDA is by Eliza Fricker. If you're interested in PDA, which is a autism profile, stands for pathological demand avoidance. It's a lovely, illustrated, easy to read book. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much,
sharing.
Naomi. That was brilliant as always. And I know you haven't been able to follow the chat necessarily, and we have the questions curated for you that I'll pass on, but the overwhelming response has been from people. Not only has it been very informative, but also very reassuring, because people are really struggling, and kids are really suffering, and parents are doubting themselves, and right here in the chat. And so it's really wonderful for you to be able to be here, and we're grateful for that. I also shared at the beginning of the chat, and so this will be something that you all get a copy of, is all of the different ways to follow Naomi, and the title of her book, but also the Substack and things like that. So people should have access to all of those things once you get the recording. And I'm not sure if you said this at the beginning, Naomi, and I missed it, but people are also wondering if, in addition to the recording, if you will be sharing the PowerPoint presentation. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
I won't, and I can't share the PowerPoint presentation because it has the illustrations in it, which are not my copyright. So
understood.
Jessica Kingsley gives me the permission to use the illustrations for my talks, but I can't kind of hand them out. So sorry, I can't.
Yes, no problem. Thank you. And also, I actually have read Eliza Fricker's other book, Can't Not Won't. So for those of you who are talking about PDA in the chat, it's also a great book. So I want to get to the questions. There have been so many of them. The first, and these are in no particular order for those of you that are on. We're just kind of trying to grasp and pull out as many as we can. First is people. There have been a couple people actually talking about how they've been trying now after leaving school to kind of engage in this sort of allowing people to, I guess, in what we say in the self-directed education world, de-school, right? By allowing them to kind of have their space and build that foundation of safety, and that they found after a long period of time, some cases even up to 2 years, their children are becoming even more withdrawn, spending more time isolated or more time on screens. And I wonder if, and people are wondering if there's something you could say about that.
Yes. So I think if your child is becoming more withdrawn rather than less withdrawn, certainly after 2 years, then you might want to be thinking about what the blocks are, which are preventing that child from being able to come out. And I think there are some children who have really high levels of anxiety, for example, where it isn't enough just to kind of let it be, that some of them will need therapy, or sometimes it's not so much. I think as a parent, you need to be thinking about how can we bring things into their life in a way that that they're going to be able to access. So, for example, many young people I talk to who are very withdrawn find their parents hard to deal with. And it's not because their parents don't really want the best for them. It's almost because their parents want the best for them that they find them hard. So I think for a young person who feels under pressure, the pressure of feeling that your parents want you to be happy is an overwhelming one. And it can feel difficult to even come out and see the kind of anxiety maybe on your parents' face of, are you feeling better? Would you like to do this? So one of the things that can help is trying to find other adults to come into your child's life, to spend time with them, who can be available. And it will, if they're the right kind of person, obviously it needs to be the right kind of person who sort of gets them and can come alongside them, then that kind of person can be lower pressure than an adult, than the parent. So, and that person can be a therapist, or they can just be a relative maybe who would be prepared to just come and sit with your child for a bit, just to try and introduce new things, to try and bring in some stimulation, because I know what people mean. There's definitely a kind of downward spiral that some young people can get into. And also, if a young person's been at school, then they get very strong messages about how important it is to be at school and what it means if you don't go to school. So I've worked with young people who will tell me that because they're no longer going to school, they're never going to amount to anything. Their life is over. They're a dropout. And they really have this very strong sense of themselves as a loser. And I think that is very hard, and it probably needs some active adult involvement to try and help them change that, because I think that's something that's really hard for young people to change for themselves. And unfortunately, I think that is a side effect of the school system for some young people. But
Yes.
go on.
I was going to say, and actually somebody else talked about that as well. They were talking about with their child that the child themselves is actually the one who is saying, you know, I really feel like I need to do all of these things that are tied to GCSEs and things like that. And the child themselves isn't necessarily buying into letting those things go. Do you have any thoughts about that?
No, it's hard. Yeah, absolutely. I meet quite a few young people who, you know, the things that we're told when we're children really stick with us. And children are told that these exams are very important. Sometimes children are told these are the most important things you'll ever do in your life, and they believe it. I think the way that I'm working on this, because lots of parents ask me about this, actually, we're working on, Eliza and I are working on a book for teenagers on burnout. And one of the things that we're going to write about in that is we're looking for stories of people who did not succeed at school, or who were excluded from school, or who have gone on to lead successful, happy lives. Because young people just don't know. They just don't know that that's possible, and they don't see those stories around them.
Yeah, we'll definitely be in touch when you do that, because I know in the Liberated Learners Network and in our centers, we have those panel discussions all the time. So we might be able to help you with that. Okay, so another question we have here is, somebody asked, do you think that there might have been some bias that only people with positive experiences of SDE were willing to speak with you in the interviews that you did for your work? And
definitely.
Did it work well for everyone?
No, I would absolutely say there's bias. I mean, I don't see my book as proper as research, and I'll tell you what I mean by that, because I have a PhD, I'm trained as a researcher. If I was doing research into what's the full experience of parents with neurodivergent children and self-directed learning, then I would have had to do a randomized sample. I didn't do that. I was instead, what I was looking to do in this book was describe what it looks like. So so it's a different kind of research. It's basically research where I'm saying, I want to look in those families for whom it's working. What does it look like? Because I felt like, certainly for me, and I think for other parents as well, that those stories weren't really out there. It was hard to find. It's a bit different now, actually. It's becoming much more visible. But when I was first home educating my kids 10, 15 years ago, you couldn't really find stories of things being different. So I was looking specifically for those positive stories of things being different. But I absolutely know that these stories don't in any way represent the whole of the experience. They can't do. And that's sort of not what I was setting out to do.
Yeah, thank you. We've had a couple of people, and two of these things are related, so I'm going to combine them into one question. But people that are talking about advice for their kids who aren't engaging in much off screens, or who are cocooning and not very physically active. And in particular cases, sometimes that's, even if it's okay for one parent, it might not be okay for spouses, or there are lots of questions and concerns around this.
Yes. Okay, so screens are a big issue. I talk about them a lot.
And you have a webinar coming up.
I have a webinar on Thursday about screens. Yes, it's about helping you. In fact, my webinar on screens on Thursday is called Helping Your Autistic Child Develop a Healthy Relationship with Screens. And it is very much about what parents can do to help their children, at least it says on the box, develop a healthy relationship with screens. And I don't simply, I think we have to take quite a nuanced approach with screens, and I'm not going to go into all of that right now. But
yes, we can get the link out to folks for that event. So yeah,
thank you. But yes, I think the answer with screens is, well, there's no answer for every child. It's different, and I'm sort of loath to give blanket advice about it because it includes so many different things. I think you need to kind of dig deep. You need to get alongside the child and see what they are doing and see what is going on, what is the pull, because there are different things. There are some kids for whom computers are just the most amazing thing that they can imagine, and that is what they want to spend their time on because it is their passion. There are other kids for whom there isn't much going on in the rest of their life, and so it's the only interesting thing there is. There are other kids who might be being bullied on social media or being bullied on WhatsApp groups, and they are kind of attached to their screen because it's a kind of compulsive, I need to check, I need to see what's going on. So and in all of those cases, I think you'd have to respond differently. But I think the first thing is find out what's going on, get alongside them, notice what they're doing, notice the good things, and try to I talk about making fine cuts. So you want to sort of move away from this concept of screens and instead be thinking about what are the different things they're doing and how are those working for them? Are there things so I mean, I have lots of stories about screens and about ways that we've responded to screens in the past. So for example, my son had a period when he was he was totally kind of wouldn't leave his iPad alone at all. And it had to be with us all the time, everywhere we went. And right from the first point of every day, he was like, where's the iPad? Where's the iPad? Where's the iPad? And at the time, I sort of spent some time noticing exactly what he was doing. And I realized that he had managed to download 27 free-to-play iPad games onto the iPad. And I don't know if anyone's played these free-to-play games, but they are really awful games in terms of playability. Basically, there isn't much playability. You have to pay to get the games to progress, and you have to have the games kind of grinding in order to do anything. Anyway, so he wasn't actually really enjoying the time on the iPad, but he couldn't leave them because he had all of these games going on and on and on that he had to keep checking in with, that sort of thing. Anyway, so in that point, I take a unilateral decision and I said, no, this is not making anybody happy. We're going to get rid of these games. And it was massive. It was not a happy moment. But I basically said, we need to do this, but I'm going to find you other higher quality games. So I think, and I did, I went off and looked for other games that had some of the elements of those free games, but were paid for games, which he could play and which had playability. So I think there's something also about looking for what need is being met by what they're doing, and can you improve the quality of that? Can you make sure they've got a really good quality experiences? The other thing you could do with screens is you can make it really easy for them to move their body whilst they're on a screen. So we have a console, and we used to have it in our front room with a mini trampoline, a swing in the door, a ball to bounce on, and one of those kind of bouncy things all there in the front room. So when you were playing, you could bounce or you could swing, and they did. So I made it really easy for them to move so that it wasn't a choice between being on the screen and moving. It was like, oh, you can move when you're on the screen. So I think things like that can often help.
Yes, awesome. Thank you. So we have a number of questions regarding just sort of the logistics of people being able to engage in self-directed education, which I know are going to be specific to the local area. So maybe let's package those and kind of push those off toward the end. But a couple of questions that are not related to that are, first of all, is it too late to start self-directed education at any particular point in a child's life?
I don't think so. I mean, I would say that I think most adults kind of become, I would say, for example, myself, I'd say I became a self-directed learner again, having been very, very schooled. You know, I went to school for as long as it's possible to go to school almost. I did 2 PhDs after my degree, and I kept going to school for a long time. But I would say that I have regained my kind of self-directed spark since then. Yeah. So I think you can do it at any stage. I think the thing you can't do at any stage is you can't start with a teenager and then assume that they are going to meet the same school-based goals. So something I see a lot in England is we have these exams that they take at 16, GCSEs. Quite a lot of people take their 13 and 14-year-olds out because that's a stage when a lot of pressure gets put on them, and many of them become very unhappy. But it's very hard to let go of doing GCSEs at 16. People feel that, you know, if you don't do GCSEs when you're 16, it's like the end of the world because everybody does these exams when you're 16. And I think that is the thing that's difficult at that age. It's not the age that's the problem, I think. And in fact, we lived in France for 2 years, and in France, they don't have exams at 16. They just have exams at 18 or 19, which are for going to university. That's it. And I found it really interesting because I was, my kids were at a self-directed school there, a Sudbury model school, and there were quite a lot of teenagers. And I found it really really interesting how much more relaxed the parents of the 13 and 14-year-olds were about their young people, because they saw them as having quite a long run up to 18 or 19 when people did their final school leaving exams. Whereas in England, we're kind of like, oh gosh, 16, the clock is ticking. And I think that is the real challenge.
Right. It's that external clock that we all believe and bought into is there. So then actually that brings me to a question that's here. That's actually very a practical question. Let's just pretend about there aren't, we don't have those exams. Aren't kids who don't go to school and who do self-directed education not really prepared for everything? Like, how do they get a job if jobs require math and English? And, even isn't that how society's designed, that without school, kids can't be successful in life? That's a question.
Well, firstly, many kids go to school and don't learn English and maths. In England, about 30% of kids fail those GCSEs at 16. So they go to the whole of school and they haven't reached a very minimum standard at 16. So school is no guarantee for these things. But also, I think that this is a way of maintaining children's drive to learn. I think self-directed education helps us keep alive that spark that we see in our young children. In our 3 and 4-year-olds, we see this drive to learn. And that drive is the thing that's going to enable them to get jobs and do things. And when I talked about this qualitative shift that I saw in my book of the kids between sort of prepubescent and adolescent kids. And one of the big changes was that in adolescence, the young people became capable of thinking about the future and doing things now that maybe weren't exactly what they would like to be doing because of the future. And I've seen that in my son, particularly now, who's 15, that when he was about 13 or 14, he was like, okay, I would like to go to university in the future and study coding. So if I want to do that, I'm going to have to do this, and then I'm going to have to do this, and then I'm going to do that. And this was like thinking that he would not have been capable of a couple of years earlier. So I think we're kind of freeing our young people up to have that kind of thought, and they may do it on different timescales. They might not decide until they're 20, or then they might be like, what, actually I'd like to go to college and I need to do this, but there's nothing stopping them from doing that.
That's right. I usually tell people I talk about people who are career changers, right? Look at that. I mean, it's the same situation. You have somebody who had decided that they were going to go in a certain field and then decide they want to do something else. It's not too late. At any point, you can do the things that you want to do when the need arises. I sometimes said that I managed to have 3 career shifts basically by the time I left. I left school because I was going to be a doctor. I went to university to study medicine, and then I did 2 years of medicine, and then I was at this course where we were allowed to do 1 year in something else. I did psychology, and I was like, this is so much more me than medicine. So I quit the medicine, moved over to psychology. Then I went to do a PhD, which is like to be an academic psychologist, researcher. I did that, and I was like, actually, no, I want to be a clinical psychologist. So I went and did another PhD. And if I'd stuck to both, collecting them up.
and I was like, that's enough.
Awesome.
I'll stick with clinical psychology.
Awesome.
And then, of course, I gave it all up to home educate my children for a while. But
well, there you go. Well, I'm just noticing that it's 3:02. We have a number of questions, and I know, Naomi, you graciously said we could go over a few moments. We will have, if those of you that though need to duck out right away, especially those in a different time zone, we understand that. But I'm going to take advantage of Naomi's graciousness and ask a couple of other questions here. But again, we'll have all of this recorded for those that need to hop off. One of the questions that kept coming up in a number of different varieties is, do you have any thoughts about people who themselves are neurodivergent and are working with trying to do what you're talking about for their and with their neurodivergent children?
Yes, so at least half of the parents I talked to in my book identified themselves as neurodivergent as well. And I think that certainly it's becoming more and more common for parents of neurodivergent children to reflect and to see those characteristics in themselves and then to identify in the same way themselves. So I think self-directed education is a process of the whole family working out what works for them, what doesn't work for them. And certainly I talked to families who would say that the sort of deschooling process, when they were unwrapping all these layers of what had been done to them at school and what had happened to them at school, was also kind of unwrapping and realizing that they themselves had many of the sensitivities that their children had, and that they had squashed it. They had kind of kept it under wraps because it hadn't been possible. So I don't think I don't think it's a disadvantage. I think it just is in a way. I think it's the reality of the world that there'll be neurodivergent parents with neurodivergent children, and I think that can be great. So I don't really see it as I think it's just the way the world is, and I think I've seen many parents doing amazing self-directed education with being neurodivergent themselves or not being neurodivergent themselves.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's wonderful. We actually, one of the things that has come up a couple times too is that one of the things that happens, especially with kids who have experienced trauma, is their sleep. Sleep gets very badly affected. And any thoughts about dealing with that sort of sleep related issues?
Yes. So I suppose if they've experienced trauma and they are having nightmares, or if they are waking up because they are in a kind of state of hyper arousal all the time, then you might want to be thinking about how you can help their bodies learn that they're safe again. So one of the things I find helpful for this is polyvagal theory. So basically you're thinking about how to help young people help their bodies relax, help their nervous systems relax. And for young people, that can be things like, it's often sensory. So it can be things like slime, or so all the way through the day, you can have things like slime available, bouncing available, all these kind of ways of regulating can be helpful. If it's specific nightmares, one of the things that actually can sometimes help young people is thinking beforehand about what they can do if there's a nightmare. I know this sounds a bit strange, but actually the research shows that if you can remember what your nightmare is, or even if you can't remember it, but if it's like a sort of terror feeling, and you can do something like the young person think like, okay, so maybe this nightmare is going to come. Who would you like to come with you and help? Would you like me to come? Okay, let's imagine that I'm going to be there to help you when we need you. We're going to put that on the shelf. And then bizarrely, the research shows that often that actually young people can incorporate that into their dreams. So you can basically talk with them about, how would you like this dream to end? How shall we make it finish this time? How are we going to help you when you're asleep to know that this is going to be different this time? And sometimes kids like to imagine or even draw characters. I'd like my stuffed animal to come and be with me and look after me. Okay, let's keep them there. And you can draw pictures and have them on the walls for nightmares.
Brilliant.
Okay,
the other thing people are wondering about is isolation. One of the time, especially in a society where school is the norm, right? Often families themselves feel isolated, and even though when we're on webinars like this, we find out, oh, everyone's feeling isolated. It doesn't help that we're still feeling isolated. Yes. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yes, it was a big issue for lots of the families I talked about. Lots of the families I talked with. There were a few things. So one of them was finding people online. Often for parents, I think it was particularly important for parents to find other families, even if the children didn't connect. Often parents would be like looking for friends for their children. And actually, I think the most important thing sometimes is to look for people for you and and think about the children later on. Because when your child is going through recovery from school, for example, the odds are it's going to be really hard to find other young people that they're going to connect with for a while. But you still need people, because you need to be there for your child. You are the social context for your child. So if you can find supportive groups or other people who are going through it, that makes all the difference. And generally, I find that is online. But then the trajectory that most families talk to me about would be that they did have a period of isolation, and then that they had to be really proactive. So lots of the parents said they really had to push themselves out their comfort zone in order to say, can we meet up, to find some local families. And then usually what happened was that they would find one or two local families, and that would be okay. That would be enough, that they had a local friend, and that would carry them through.
Right.
Yeah,
absolutely.
But it is hard.
And how do you deal with kids who really they're uncomfortable getting into those social situations, but they desperately want it?
Yeah, that is tricky. I think you need, again, to find other families who understand that, because there will be other families who have that same experience. I often say to families when they contact me and they say things like, we don't leave the house, and and everybody else seems to be out in the groups and everybody else is talking about this. I'm like, no, there's loads of others who don't leave the house. They just don't post about it on Facebook, so you don't know, but they're all there. They could be in your next house and you wouldn't even know because they're not telling you. But so you need to find other families who get you. I mean, what happened with us was, in our hardest times, I found other families and I basically said, can we meet up even though the children may not interact at all? Could we just meet up anyway? And can we just carry on meeting up anyway? And it worked. Like, we have families now who we are still friends with, and maybe the first 10 times that we met up, the children ignored each other. And we just kind of kept on going through. But also lots of young people who find in-person social interactions really hard, find online interactions easier. And the great, I think, bonus for a parent with online stuff, particularly if it's voice online stuff that you can hear, is that you can be a bit more involved too. You can kind of keep an ear on what's going on.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the other things is, and this might probably be our last question, but is there any fear that children will feel, will have secondary trauma, if you will, or trauma related to failing, if your children simply want to be in school, but then they can't? And how do we deal with the fact that they want it and they really think that that's important but can't?
Yeah, that's really hard. And I think it's really important then. I mean, they've obviously got a message from somewhere that they have to be in school. So I think it's important to counter that message as a parent. And I would be I would come with a very strong message about learning how some environments work for us and some don't, and that it is okay, even if we want something to work out. Like I tell stories about myself all the time, because I find that children don't like anything that puts them on the spot. Generally, they like to hear, but they're much more receptive to stuff about other people. So, for example, I tell a story about a job that I actually really wanted to work out. I thought it would be a great job for me. I really was keen to do it, and I went into the job, and it was in an open plan office. And I'd never worked in an open plan office before. But the way my job worked, so I'd either be seeing children, working with them, or I'd be in this open plan office. So there was no time for me to decompress. And I discovered very quickly, I'm someone who needs to be able to close the door for a bit and have a bit of time off. But I also discovered that this open plan office was full of social workers and other psychologists. And it was a place for traumatized children, the centre I was working at. And so I was sitting in this open plan office hearing stories of trauma all the time on the phone, because the social workers would be calling up on the phone, they'd be telling the stories of the children. Really quickly, I started to feel very unwell when I was there. I just started to not be able to sleep. I felt prickly all the time. This was a job I really, really wanted. I was really delighted to get it. But after 5 weeks, I resigned, and I just couldn't, wasn't the right job for me. And I think I do tell children stories like that about myself, that I'm saying, sometimes, and now I know, now if I go to a job interview, I'm like, do you have an open plan office? Okay, this isn't going to be the right job for me. But I didn't know that until I'd had that chance to work it out. And I think growing up is that process. And sometimes it is a process of thinking, I'd like to do this, but I can't, but I can find other ways to do it.
Yes, absolutely. The last question, this is pretty specific, so I'm not sure, and I'm not even really sure if it's it's not really specific to self-directed education, but any recommendations for children seeing things like demons, for example, at a heightened anxiety or meltdown stage?
Okay, yes. I mean, that is something that happens, so I wouldn't panic about it. It's something that lots of families have told me about. I think it's one way that our brains respond to intense stress. And I would talk about it like that to your child. So I think one of the most disturbing thing about thinking you're seeing demons is thinking they're real. And if your child does think they're real, and they still continue to think they're real, even when they are no longer in that heightened state of emotion, then you might want to check that out with somebody. But if it's when they're in a highly intense state, they see these things, but then afterwards they're like, no, it was imaginary, then you want to be talking about, when we're stressed, funny things happen, strange things happen to us when we're really, really intensely stressed. think of some examples from yourself about one of the things that happens to me when I'm intensely stressed is my body prickles all over. It feels really, really weird. It feels like sort of pins and needles all the way over. So just if you can normalize it for them like that, then really what you're wanting is for them to be able to say, oh, I'm really stressed, this thing's happening. In fact, one of the things that quite a lot of the kids I talk to, the older teenagers I talk to, who found it difficult to identify their emotions, these autistic young people, they would often say that they used things like that to tell that they were really stressed. So they would be able to say, oh, this is happening, I must be really stressed. And it was actually really useful for them to be able to use those kind of things. So I would point those things out to your children. When you're stressed, these things happen. When I'm really stressed, these things happen. And it's just how aren't our brains amazing kind of thing.
Yes, yes. A number of people have commented on the challenge of trying to facilitate all of this while they're also trying to earn income and work. And,
absolutely, yes.
There's not really a question around that. Just
it's enormously challenging. Nobody makes it easy. I often say it's in no way a convenient choice, in no way. And there is no easy route. They're definitely the route that society wants you to take is send your kids to the local school, and that's what they're going to facilitate.
That's right.
But maybe I could chime in here, because Liberated Learners works with people to create centers for this. So if you're the kind of person that would be interested to create centers, like Andrea and I have cohorts of kids at our centers that we're offering them the choice. We have like a number of neurodivergent kids there, and we're offering them the choice of what and when and how they want to learn.
Brilliant.
That's right. So finding those centers. And I will also say that if you are one of the people who had talked about in the US wondering how you deal with the fact that in the US children have to show progress, of course that varies from state to state, and you don't know how to be able to comply with the law while engaging in self-directed education, you can also be in touch with Liberated Learners, and we might be able to they might be able to help you find a place locally where you can consult with someone to answer those questions, because that is what many of us do for a living. And we also have access to resources in our communities of being able to get those kinds of answers. There were also some folks posting in the chat that there is a movement of people right now trying to actually work to change the law or change the wording at the United Nations level with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and try to clarify what compulsory education means as more of and Sylvie just put the link in the chat for My Life, My Education. And that's about trying to help the UNCRC redefine compulsory as it must be made available to, but it doesn't need to be forced upon. So anybody that wants to get involved in that movement, there's a way to do that. And I'm going to pass things over to Allison to wrap us up. Thank you, Naomi. I can't tell you, I wish I could capture for you all of the love that you've gotten in the chat. So many people in tears and people just saying how helpful it's been. So once again, a great honor to be with you, but we'll send you the chat for sure.
Yeah, we'll send you the chat. Hopefully it saves. It didn't save last time, but I think I have the settings correct. And so we'll send it to you. Anyway, thank you all for being here today, and special thanks to Dr. Naomi Fisher for joining us. This is just so terrific, right? The love and so many people, like tears, and this is exactly what I need. It's just so wonderful. Again, we'll be sending a follow-up email to everyone who registered on Eventbrite with the recording of Naomi's talk, and related self-directed education resources. We'll cull all the resources that were posted in the chat and include all of those. We hope you'll join us for our next event. We're going to be screening the movie Self-Taught, which is a movie about that portrays the lives of 6 young adults who self-directed their education. We're offering 2 dates and times. January 13th will be at 11 a.m. Eastern. So for those around the world, a couple hours earlier than, maybe 3 hours earlier than today's start. And then January 23rd at 7 p.m. Eastern time. If you follow Liberated Learners event page, you'll be notified when tickets are available. You can also sign up on the website. You could sign up for the newsletter, and it comes out about once a month, and you'll be notified that way as well. So thank you, everyone. And this is in conclusion.
Yes.